So for those of you who didn't attend last week's session, this is a series that we are presenting on the Delaware River watershed, covering everything from the history of the river to arts and culture in relation to the river. And it's in preparation for our On the Water kayak program, which we hope to launch probably in July of this year, in which we'll take people on kayak excursions from Bordentown Beach up the Crosswicks Creek as a way to really fully immerse in the Delaware River watershed and learn more about its history and ecology and all of that. So thank you for all joining us today. Last week we heard about the geographical extent of the watershed, what is a watershed, ways to keep our watershed clean, as well as the history associated with the Delaware River. And today we have a really exciting topic where we'll be learning about the ecology of the Delaware River. D&R Greenway Land Trust, we have preserved over 21,000 acres of land in the central New Jersey area. And what we'll be hearing about today is some of the wildlife that exists on this land. So I'm really happy to introduce to all of you David Wheeler, our guest speaker for tonight. David is the executive director of the nonprofit Conserve Wildlife Foundation of New Jersey. Since 2012, David has directed CWF's work in wildlife conservation, habitat restoration, public engagement, and environmental education. He previously taught environmental communication at Rutgers University's School of Environmental and Biological Sciences for 7 years. A proud New Jerseyan, David has written frequently about the state's surprising biodiversity, including the 2011 book, Wild New Jersey, Native Adventures in the Garden State. He earned his MBA from New York University's Stern School of Business and his BA from American University in Washington, DC. He was also a 2017 Lead New Jersey Fellow. David enjoys being active outdoors with his family in his spare time. So with that, I will turn it over to David Wheeler.
Great. Thank you so much, Maria, and good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to speak to you tonight, and I'm excited to talk about the Delaware River and in a sense, just to kind of give you an idea of how I'm looking to approach this. We'll kind of take a journey downstream, starting with its headwaters and floating, shall we say, all the way down to the Delaware Bay and admiring the wildlife along the way. So without further ado, I don't need to spend any time on the bio. Thank you, Maria. Just a brief word about Conserve Wildlife Foundation. We are a nonprofit that for the past 20 years has worked to protect rare wildlife all around the state and beyond. And our mission is driven by three main areas. The first and primary mission is the field science. Our biologists work in the field on a variety of species, including many of the ones we'll be speaking about tonight. Things like monitoring and surveying and banding many of the wildlife species. And then we support that with habitat restoration and enhancement, and with environmental education and public engagement in events like this one. And so I thank D&R Greenway for hosting this and giving us the opportunity to speak to you tonight. So I wanted to start in the upper Delaware River, and if we could go back a few decades, not all that long ago. When I was younger, my first bald eagle sighting in the wild was in the upper Delaware River. And that was no surprise because at the time, at the risk of dating myself, at the time, that was really about the only place you'd have any kind of luck in the general New Jersey area, a little going beyond New Jersey's borders even. It was one of the few and closest places where you'd have a reasonable chance of seeing a bald eagle in the wild. At the time, we only had one failing nest in New Jersey through much of the 80s. And it was in the most remote part of southwestern New Jersey. And as I mentioned, for 6 straight years, it failed. So bald eagles were, to put it mildly, they were tough to see in the wild, nearly impossible in much of New Jersey. And it's no surprise that one of the places that had them and that I had to go to see them was the Delaware River. I still remember canoeing that day and looking up and seeing out of the corner of my eye along the riverbanks on the far side, the Pennsylvania side, a quick flyby by an adult bald eagle, and it just took my breath away and completely put me in awe, and kind of give me a big smile for the rest of that canoe trip. And it would be remarkable at the time to think where bald eagles came from them, but from that point on, and their recovery. And in many ways, it mirrors the recovery of the Delaware River, which we're going to talk about. The Delaware River, through much of that time, at least parts of the Delaware River, were a far cry from what we see today. And so let's take a look. To give you an idea about just how important the Delaware River is, for myself, when I wrote the book Wild New Jersey: Nature Adventures in the Garden State, I checked last night, and just about a little under half of the chapters in the book, and then this is all about wildlife and outdoor activities across New Jersey, a little less than half the chapters in the book were either centered completely on, or a huge part of it were about somewhere along the Delaware River or the watershed itself, which is remarkable when you think about it. And it speaks to just how important it is to the state itself and important to the state's ecology. And perhaps seeing it in this form, rather than kind of just the New Jersey side, looking at the Delaware River watershed as a whole, as many of you, if you were in last week's talk, learned a great deal about. Looking at it as a whole, you see it goes in 5 different states. It holds around 13,000 square miles, give or take, within the watershed. It's a massive, for the Northeast, it's a really massive waterway. It's one of the biggest waterways in the Northeast. And specifically for wildlife, one of the things that's really beneficial is it's the longest undammed river east of the Mississippi River, all the way up to Trenton. It's undammed. And what that means for fish, and then in turn for so many other marine creatures, for the birds that depend on fish, for the mammals that eat fish, it has created a thriving ecosystem in many parts of that, in many parts of the river. And yet, on the same time, even beyond the dam, then going up to its headwaters, is one of the most remarkable habitats in the northeastern U.S., which we're going to take a look at right now, starting with those headwaters. So the headwaters is in New York State, as you can see here, east of Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania border, after you get too far north for New Jersey. And it's a stunningly gorgeous area, small towns, really driven by the waterways, the lakes, the rivers, the really at this point streams and brooks and ponds. And this is an area of covered bridges and just a beautiful area, very different from other parts of the Delaware River. In some ways, some of it looks similar to some of the areas in the D&R Greenway area, where some of the smaller towns that have the tributaries that go into the Delaware, kind of in some places, these are kind of snapshots lost in time. And for this, the headwaters, it's a region really driven around the waterways and around the outdoor recreation, whether it's wildlife viewing, bird watching, hunting, fishing, really drives a huge part. Around 10% of the in the headwaters and upper river, around 10% of the economy in that area is driven by outdoor recreation, centered in many ways around the upper river. I know for me, this was always an annual camping spot for my family and I years ago, and as a matter of fact, it was really one of those things where you'd go to it and you'd feel like you were states away from New Jersey. I'm sorry. All right, can you see that still? Okay, great. And that timeless quality I mentioned, in many ways, translated to the wildlife too. When you were there, it was easy to picture how the area might have looked centuries before. And I what comes to mind is a quote yesterday from Chief Man of the Ramapo, the Lenape Ramapo Nation, based in northern New Jersey right now, but throughout the northeastern region a couple centuries ago. He noted that to his tribe, the Delaware River was originally named the Lenape River, the river of the people. And I loved hearing that. That was just talk about capturing the Delaware River right now, and not just up in the headwaters, but the whole river. I feel like that captures it about as well as anything. And back in those days, we'll say the pre-colonial era through the early American era, early U.S. era, you had wildlife species that we wouldn't find today: mountain lions and gray wolves, buffaloes, elk. Buffaloes you'd find in the Pennsylvania side, not in huge number. The other three there you would find in very healthy populations before they were ultimately driven out of the Northeast. Elk have started to return. I don't believe they've reached the Delaware River watershed yet, but they're getting closer. They're in mid Pennsylvania in the northern part, and they're moving eastward little by little. We also had species that have since gone extinct, like the passenger pigeon and the Carolina parakeet, all thriving in the Delaware River watershed. And while we've lost these species over time, we're fortunate that not only have we maintained many others, but we've also seen new species come in and others recover. One of the areas where we have the broadest and most unique ranges of wildlife species is the illustrious Delaware Water Gap. This area north of, for all of us who drive anywhere in New Jersey, it's always easiest to pinpoint it by highways, for better or for worse. But north of Route 80, along the western edge of New Jersey, if you're not familiar with the region, the Delaware Water Gap rises above, literally rises above Route 80 as you cross into Pennsylvania. And it's one of the most gorgeous areas in the whole East Coast. Just absolutely stunning mountain scenery, built along the winding river, which was just dotted with islands and old bridges. Really gorgeous. And from the wildlife perspective, it's about as a magnificent an area as you get in New Jersey. A couple of areas which I'm going to point out through this, and then at the end as well, some areas I recommend visiting if you haven't, or revisiting if maybe you went years ago, are places within the Water Gap and then north on the Kittatinny Ridge. This is an area where some of the best recreation you can find in New Jersey, you can find in this region: tubing, canoeing, kayaking, mountain hiking. You have all of this in this area, and well worth the visit for in the time to come, especially this summer. For me, the best road in New Jersey for observing wildlife runs right along the Delaware Water Gap and right along the Delaware River, which is Old Mine Road. Old Mine Road is the last exit in New Jersey on off of Route 80 before you go into Pennsylvania. And from there, you actually have because it's kind of isolated and because it follows this former trail, initially a Native American trail, and then a pre-colonial trail, horseback trail, that it basically winds along the edge of the mountain sides, the mountain slopes, and you get into one lane with a light at the beginning, because it's so narrow. But this is an area that to me is the equivalent to driving a safari, except you're not in an area like Six Flags. You're in the wild, and you never know what you're going to see there. I'm going to note a number of species right now that if someone was to ask me what's the best place to have a chance to see this species in New Jersey, almost every answer for the next half dozen species would be Old Mine Road and the Water Gap. It's just, it really is a fantastic place. One of the best options for the Old Mine Road and the Water Gap right now is the warblers, the migrating warblers coming through as we speak, and then again in the fall. You're talking about species that you can see elsewhere in the state, but this is one of the best fallout areas. The Delaware River Flyway is a huge part of the Great Atlantic Flyway, and it's easy to see why when you look at an aerial. The immense amount of protected and wooded and other natural habitat land along either side of the Delaware River as it winds through the northern part of the state. It's easy to see why it's such a magnet for migrating birds. So we're talking about birds like the cerulean warbler, the blue-winged warbler, the Blackburnian warbler, the magnolia warbler, and the hooded warbler, just to give you a handful of species. And again, you can see these elsewhere. You might even get lucky and see one in your yard, but you increase your odds significantly by going up to a place like Old Mine Road. A couple other species that are in that region, in the northern part along the ridge and just beyond within the watershed. A couple of unique species I wanted to highlight are the golden wing warbler. Similar to the others in some ways, it migrates here from Central and South America. It is facing a decline, just the way those other species are. Many of our songbirds are facing a decline, and the climate change has certainly exacerbated that for so many bird species. The migrants, if you think about it, have it that much tougher because it's not just one area that might be declining or facing new challenges that are made worse by climate change, but the areas they migrate to and from all can kind of worsen that problem. For golden wing warblers, it's especially challenging. We're down to about less than 5% of its population of a century ago. And it depends on young forest. And the area in the greater Water Gap and Kittatinny area, Kittatinny Ridge and east of that tends to be now older forest by New Jersey standards. So not quite old growth. It was cleared, a century ago or more. But by New Jersey standards, it's very old forest compared to most of the rest of it. And because it's a habitat, it tends to like the colder temperatures. It tends to be found further north of here. It really is holding on to just a handful of areas in New Jersey where you still have, a few warblers here and there. So it's one of our most rapidly declining species that we're working to create that young forest habitat to still maintain it here in New Jersey. The bog turtle faces similar challenges, but in a different way. It used to be widespread across the state to some degree. It thrives, just like its name, the bog turtle thrives in bogs and mucky, not quite swamps filled with water, but rather the kind of muddy remnants of it. And so where they've thrived in the last 100 years has been in places where you had heavy grazing livestock. So New Jersey's name, the Garden State, over the first 100 or so years of our existence within the US and the colonial days, we had plenty of farms. We were the breadbasket of the US for quite some time, and bog turtles could thrive in that because the hooves and the weight of those animals would kind of keep that soil enriched and wet and everything else that the bog turtles need. As those have moved on, bog turtles' habitat has diminished quite a bit. And so now they're relegated to really the northwest part of the state and the smaller population in the southwest part of the state, both within the Delaware River watershed. So that's a species we've lost about 50% of our bog turtle population, and our scientists are working with landowners, farmers especially, to maintain areas that are still suitable and to try to keep those in existence and kind of in the right conditions for bog turtles. Bobcats is an animal that, unlike those last two, bobcats are doing much better than they had been. Bobcats we had lost almost entirely. Actually, it was believed that they were gone from the state, that they were extirpated back in the 60s. It turned out a few had hung on as sightings then came in. There was also a reintroduction done by scientists. And so essentially we created a melting pot of bobcats here in New Jersey. We had bobcats brought in from Maine, mixed with bobcats that came back naturally from Pennsylvania and New York, along with the very few remnant population that stayed here. And in recent decades, bobcats have little by little made their comeback. And so now north of Route 80, again, north of Route 78 to a lesser degree, is our most healthy bobcat population. Occasionally you'll see them outside of that area, but that's where they thrive the most. It's the wildest part of the state, again, especially along the Delaware River. And I haven't been fortunate enough myself, but I've heard of people getting lucky on Old Mine Road and happen to catch a bobcat sighting. So I envy them. I will say, the one time I have seen a bobcat in the wild, I had help. It was a release. It was a bobcat being released, and its story captures kind of the story not only of the bobcat as a whole in a microcosm, but of many other mammal species here in New Jersey. It was hit by a car, and that's the biggest threat to bobcats and one of the biggest threats to many of our species here in New Jersey. And this individual bobcat was hit by a car on a winter night. Even though it was in a remote area, it happened to be close enough to one home that the person living there heard the screech of the tires, ran out, immediately acted, called animal control, who ultimately got them in, put them in touch with the right folks who were able to get the bobcat to a veterinarian who was actually able to do surgery. Had not all those things transpired as quickly as they did, the bobcat would have died. It was hit badly. It had broken its leg in a few places. It had injuries internally and a concussion as well. It definitely wouldn't have lasted on its own. Remarkably, over a few months, it was rehabilitated by Woodlands Wildlife Refuge. Tracy Lever, you see here, and Gretchen Fowles, the New Jersey state biologist who runs the Bobcat program in partnership with Conserve Wildlife. They were integral in terms of making sure the bobcat was in the best possible situation and able to rehabilitate. And we were fortunate that this cat was able to improve in health enough that it was able to be released again to the wild. And so they brought it out to a mountain slope in northwestern New Jersey. And in this enclosure here, I was there along with a few photographers at a very far distance. And if any of you have had a house cat at home or have now house cats at home, you know that cats are great at doing exactly what you want them to do when you want them to do it, right? They just naturally follow our instructions. And so similarly, when Gretchen and Tracy lifted the lid off this enclosure and you know, you're free, the cat looked around and went back in there and stayed for about, it was probably about 4 minutes, but it felt like about 4 hours for all of us watching. We were just, oh no, it's not gonna go, it's not gonna go. And then when the cat was good and ready, when the bobcat was on their timetable, fully good and ready, it bound out of the enclosure and tore up that mountain trail. It took literally about 2 seconds to vanish, you know, about 100 yards up that trail and out of our sight. And it took probably another 10 seconds for any of us to breathe again. It was just that, you know, catching your breath, that absolutely breathtaking moment was fantastic. And really kind of a sign of the bobcat as a whole, as it had that sharp decline followed by the steady recovery, thanks to people. You know, people on both sides of that. People were a big cause of the decline through hunting and clearing so much land, but then they've also been a big part of that recovery, and that's a common theme we'll see in many other species. Porcupines are not a species you associate with New Jersey, and yet we have a population that does well along the Delaware River in the northwestern part of the state. They are they're an animal with an absolutely almost ironclad protection with those quills. My son and I, a few years ago, were fortunate enough to see a porcupine from a healthy distance up on Mount Tammany in the Delaware Water Gap. And the same from the cover of my book, which is where I chose for the cover of my book, was from Mount Tammany, gorgeous hiking trail, one of the best in the state. And so we followed the porcupine again from a healthy distance, and it got to see it climb a tree. And they have the reputation for shooting quills. They don't shoot quills, but as we noticed from afar, seeing it climb the tree, if they do feel threatened, they hunch their body, like many mammals do this. They hunch their body up to look bigger and to ward off an attack. And in doing so, quills will be dislodged. So if an animal or a person are unfortunate enough to be standing below them in the tree, those quills might come falling down, and it's the last thing you want to get in you. They're kind of double barbed the way fishing hooks are, so they don't come out easy. So no animals will eat porcupines, not bears, bobcats, or others, with one exception: the fisher. The fisher is a misnamed. It should not be named the fisher. I wasn't in charge of that, you know, a few hundred years ago when it was named. But this relative of the wolverine and the weasel lives its life. It's arboreal. It lives its life mostly in trees. It was believed to be gone completely from New Jersey for 100 years or more until a researcher, Charles Contos, about a decade and a half ago, believed while he was going for his graduate work here in New Jersey, believed that he would believe that we had fishers in the wild. All his advisors told him he was crazy, he was wasting his time. Put up camera traps all throughout Stokes State Forest and High Point State Park. And after many months of getting all this incredible wildlife documentation, but no fishers, right when he was about ready to have to wrap up the project, he got a documentation that the fisher was indeed back in New Jersey. And just in the last couple of years, we got a additional documentation, again through camera traps, that fishers are breeding in New Jersey. So they're truly here as opposed to just passing through. But as I mentioned, the fisher is the only animal that can eat the porcupine. The way it does it is they're great, like I said, they're great tree climbers. They're very agile, and they'll chase the porcupine up to the top of the tree. It gets too narrow to hold the porcupine at some point, and it'll lose its footing and fall. As it's falling, the fisher's scrambling down, gets to it before it can upright itself, and gets to its soft underbelly that isn't protected by quills. So really a unique prey and predator relationship there in both senses of the word. And again, certainly neither of those animals are species you would ever associate with New Jersey in the day-to-day life. If you're from that area, it might be different. I know from central New Jersey, porcupines and fishers are not something I grew up thinking about. Oh, maybe I'll get to see one out today. But they're here in the Garden State. Here's one I think it's safe to say none of us would associate with New Jersey, nor should we. However, we did have a documented sighting a couple decades ago of a wild moose that made it down here from the Adirondacks. The state biologist office got a call one day. Oh, here we go, another crackpot calling in a moose sighting. And was the reaction of one of the biologists. And they checked it out anyway up in Culver's Lake in the Delaware Water Gap. And it was legitimate. The moose had, they don't know if it got disoriented, if it was a young, and this isn't the individual moose, I should say. This is just a photo of a moose. For those want to be very specific. So it might not have been an old moose like this. It might have been a younger one. It was a younger one, and so the moose that actually came there made its way down all the way from the Adirondacks. But if you think about that distance, it speaks to not only the moose's capacity to travel, but it also speaks to that contiguous land up going from the Adirondacks to the Catskills to the northwestern part of New Jersey, where you have these incredible landscapes that are still connected, even though there's roads cutting through and that those cause problems for wildlife. You still have this great habitat that goes all the way down along the river, and as we'll come to shortly, continues to come south all the way into central New Jersey as well. Two other species that depend on that kind of connective habitat are, of course, the black bear and the coyote. The other species I've been talking about are kind of found primarily or only really in the Northwest. These two, of course, are found in every county in the state. The Northwest is still the best place to see a black bear. In fact, the northwestern part of New Jersey holds a section of the Adirondack Trail, the Appalachian Trail, sorry. And the Appalachian Trail, which runs from Maine to Georgia, according to many of the wildlife officials federally, the best place for, well, best or worst, depending on your perspective, the place you're most likely to encounter a bear on the entire Appalachian Trail is New Jersey's section, which runs through parts of Sussex County, and I believe a little bit in, and a little bit in through Passaic, northern Passaic County as well. And that has more bears per mile than any other section on that entire trail. And coyotes are in every county as well. There's been sightings in most towns. Coyotes and bears, in many ways, though, they want to stay in a healthy situation. They want to stay as far as they can from people directly. That being said, we can cause problems by doing things like leaving garbage out. If you know a coyote's been sighted in your area or bears can be found in your area, it's always of utmost importance to keep your garbage sealed and not easy to knock over, not leave pet food out at night. And if you're in an active area, even things like bird seed, you want to be smart about at night and not leave anything that will attract either them directly or other animals that they would prey on at night, when you're most likely to have them exploring. During day, they're less likely, unless the animal's sick or injured. It's much less likely to be seen during the day in most places in the state. And so coming down further downstream, we enter what I'll call the greater DNR region. And so this is the region of central New Jersey along the Delaware River and within that watershed. And this area, and here's one of the maps. I couldn't put the full map of the D&R Greenway's protected properties because it was simply too big to include on the PowerPoint. But this gives you a snapshot of many of those protected properties. And I believe the number I heard at the gala last night was 316 properties that have been protected now by D&R Greenway. So I commend them for that. And what that does is it's not just important for itself, but it connects habitat for wildlife as well. And that's huge. And the latest one is, of course, Point Breeze that was just announced in this past year. And of course, it has all the history, which you may have heard about in the other talk. But from the wildlife perspective, too, it's at a great location. It's at the junction of Crosswicks Creek, where it enters, and another smaller creek where they enter the Delaware River, where you also have some marsh. You have small islands as well. So you have this kind of perfect riverfront habitat and these bluffs that offer really diverse habitat within this one site. And what's great about it too is because of the human and the cultural connections, essentially this preservation of this site has created an area where people can engage with the river and engage with wildlife in a very high profile and visible location, even if that wasn't their intent, even if they were going there for the cultural and historical importance of it, they may end up getting inspired as well by the wildlife side of things as in addition to that. So really fantastic, and looking forward to the kayak trips that are coming up at the close of this series as well, because seeing, of course, this whole region from the river is an absolutely incredible way to see it. I know I still remember a kayak trip I took from Bordentown over a decade ago, and I remember it like it was last week, being so knocked out by the sites and the wildlife of it. So I commend DNR for that preservation. And as I mentioned, this connective habitat that we see in the northwest part of the state, we see it in our state parks and wildlife management areas and wildlife refuges. So in the northwestern part, you have places like High Point and Stokes and Delaware Water Gap and all the various state parks and forests along the Kittatinny Ridge. Of course, you have the checkerboard and connective part of the preservations by DNR along the Delaware River in the central part of the state. And as I mentioned, this helps so many wildlife species. I mean, we talked about some of the larger mammals. Salamanders, during their migrations, the connectivity basically has saved species from probably being lost in New Jersey. Bog turtles, quail. I mean, there's so many, and of course, many of our other smaller mammals as well depend on, weasels, mink, that kind of thing, depend on having connectivity. The less road crossings they have to do on a day-to-day basis while they're searching for food or for a mate, the more likely that they can live to have another generation. And so this is a huge priority for the state of New Jersey, for the Division of Fish and Wildlife. And so we, along with many other conservation groups, are partnering with them to help protect land and thus protect species. And by protect land, in many cases, it's simply connecting already protected land, finding those places that kind of maximize it. And so this is a huge initiative, and that's what makes the work DNR is doing all that more important. And we've seen dividends as well. Bobcats, as I mentioned, are mostly found north of Route 78. Just a couple of years ago, we had a bobcat confirmed in Mercer County through a trail cam and in the Sauerlands region. And we have sightings of bobcats in places like that, but most often they're not documented. So it's tough to tell. They could be legit or they might not be. There might be misidentification. So when you get the trail cam confirming it, it often will also confirm the importance of those contiguous corridors. The waterways, having that contiguous quality on the waterways is also important. And so what I mean by that is the fact that the Delaware is undammed south of Trenton has allowed many species of fish to make a comeback in the Delaware. And as dams get removed further north, that also allows the fish, and some fish can get past the Trenton Falls, and it allows them to go further and further upstream. Of course, for fish aficionados, say that one 5 times fast. For those aficionados, the American shad is the return of the king, so to speak. This is one that has been championed by, especially removing those dams from any of the tributaries. As those dams get removed, shad can return to the places that they need to go as part of their life cycle. This is a fish that over the course of its lifetime will swim around 12,000 miles in the course of its migrations, and it's usually happening right about now that's being spotted in places like the Delaware River. So that's a great comeback story. But you have other fishes as well, species as well, that depend on it. Everything from the eastern brook trout to the striped bass to the river herring. And so having the river healthy again, you're seeing these fish in numbers that you wouldn't have been able to see a couple of decades ago. In the skies, we're seeing a similar variety and diversity here in the central part of the state. This is a nice little colorful mix. You have American tree swallow, you have the goldfinch, you have the scarlet tanager, indigo bunting, rose-breasted grosbeak, just a handful of the species you can see. These are more common than the ones that I pointed out for the Delaware Water Gap region. But these are still at risk. They're still among species that are showing signs of declining through climate change. Goldfinch numbers have gone down already, and as a state bird, we may even end up losing them from New Jersey because of climate change as their range shifts further north. So it's certainly something to keep an eye on, and certainly something that many groups are working on to try to give them a fighting chance. And this is, of course, where all of us can play our part by offering habitat in our yard and bird feeders for those migrating birds, and especially planting native plants wherever we can. A visitor we get in this region along the Delaware, in many places actually, is the snowy owl. Every winter we get this bird coming here. Merrill Creek Reservoir is a place in past winters that it's been spotted. Typically, we don't share exact owl locations, but this was reported widely through the media in that year. And often the snowy owl will pick a spot where it's somewhat remote from a lot of human activity. It loves flat areas, so a reservoir in that sense offers a pretty great location, as do many of the beaches and many of the areas along the river where before you get to the more mountainous ranges, it would be much less likely to be found upstream than it would in the lower part by Delaware Bay up through central New Jersey. But yeah, it comes every winter, and it's looking for basically the ones that come down here. Like with many species, it's the younger ones that have kind of left home for the first time and are looking for territory on their own. So they come further south to New Jersey than some of the adult ones, which would stay farther north of here. Two other groups of species that are worth pointing out and for their prominence here in central New Jersey are grassland birds like the bobolink and the American kestrel, the grasshopper sparrow, and others. One of their last holdouts is within this Delaware River central region, where you still have a lot of farms and a lot of grassland habitat. as much of the rest of the state has lost that over time, as those farms have turned into warehouses and strip malls and condominium complexes, and McMansions. We've still maintained much of that habitat here, even though it's declining. And these grassland birds are thus declining all around the state. And so they're one of the species that we really, groups of species that we really have to work to protect by maintaining that kind of habitat. We work with farmers as well to plant, during times when they're not planting crops, that they plant kind of warm season grasses that will still serve as great habitat for these grassland birds. Another group of species is our bats. Bats all across New Jersey. We have 9 species as a whole, but of those 9, all but 2 are showing signs of decline, and a few of them, the little brown bat and the long-eared bat, the northern long-eared bat, have declined insanely sharply. I mean, we're talking up to 98, 99% of their former winter hibernating populations were being found. And that's all because of something called white nose syndrome, which spread like wildfire about a decade and a half ago across these bat populations. It spreads especially among bats that hibernate in caves or mines, as we see in parts of the upper watershed. And the bats are huddled together for warmth. It arrived here, I should mention as well, by a person, someone who was exploring caves in Europe, unwittingly brought over this fungus that causes white nose syndrome, probably on the person's equipment or boots. And once it got into one of the caves or mines, it basically went right through the population. And what it does is it disrupts their hibernation, the torpor that they're in throughout the winter. It disrupts them, so they start flying instead of staying still and conserving their energy through the winter. They start flying, and they either leave the cave and basically are exposed to the winter elements, or they just burn through their energy and they don't last the winter. And so you saw this huge die-off. It's spread all across, starting in Albany area through New Jersey and then all across the US in the last decade. While the numbers have stopped declining to some degree, they've plateaued. It's going to take a while to build back because they're not fast breeders. And it's really, these species are going to be touch and go for some time. And so they're one of the groups of species that we're working most closely with because of that vulnerability. Another group like that is pollinators. Pollinators have declined very sharply. Most of them have, or many of them have. The monarch in particular has been one of our fastest declining species. And it's a shame because not only is it our most highly visible or highly recognizable, I should say, and beautiful species, but it also has one of the coolest migration stories coming here every year from the mountains of central Mexico, which would be quite a migration for a small insect that hardly weighs anything at all. But it's more remarkable when you factor in that these monarchs migrate over 3 or 4 or 5 generations. So just think about how foreign that is to our human understanding, that you have entire generations that literally just live for some leg of a journey. And yet instinctually, they're able to do this over those multiple generations every year. And many of our bumblebees, of course, have also declined in recent years. You have the colony collapse disorder. You have, impacts on many different bee and butterfly and moth species. And just to put it into perspective, 1 out of every 3 bites of food we eat are thanks to a pollinator. So your breakfast this morning, whether it was a healthy one, with nice and fruits and orange juice, and or even if you had some chocolate or some of the sweets, in many ways, this pollinators made that possible. A different kind of insect that we're also seeing in this region that we don't want to see is, of course, the spotted lanternfly, which has arrived with a vengeance. It's an invasive insect that causes major damage. There's no real good predators for it. And it threatens native plants and threatens our native insects that depend on those native plants. So it's absolutely one we don't want to see. And if you do see it, there's different ways to report it. The most common one is just calling New Jersey DEP at 1-877 warn DEP, especially if you see a new population that hadn't been there before. And so from the DNR region going further downstream, we enter the metropolitan area of Philly and Camden and the closer suburbs. And this is an area that just a few decades ago was literally a dead zone. The dissolved oxygen, because of all the pollution, dissolved oxygen was virtually down to zero. That means there was nothing for fish and other creatures in the water to live on. And so nothing could live for miles. And this was for a couple of decades. And it was a function of the fact that, of course, you had this thriving metropolis along the river, on both sides of the river. But then you also had the way it was done through the 60s was basically any kind of factory or plant you would set up next to a river. And because the whole benefit of that, in addition to transportation benefits, was that all your waste would go right into the river. It was a way to wash away your waste without you don't have to pay anybody to ship it. You just dump it right in. And so we saw that firsthand on the Delaware River, to the extent where not only did you have this massive dead zone, but it was so bad that pilots at the time would fly over and literally get sick flying over the Delaware River in those small planes. They would get sick because the fumes were so strong, even thousands of feet up. And we're fortunate that since then the water, thanks to things like the Clean Water Act, federal laws, and I know one of the future speakers is going to talk a lot more about all this, from Delaware River Network, which is a fantastic group that's helped the Delaware River clean up to such a great degree. And the wildlife has seen the benefits of that, and we've seen the benefits through the wildlife. One of the great examples is the peregrine falcon, which was gone east of the Mississippi River as recently as the 70s. And yet now it's found. We have about 30 pairs in New Jersey. Philadelphia has a pair nesting right in downtown. Some of the areas right along the New Jersey side, the Delaware Water Gap, also Trenton, have nesting pairs as well. So the peregrine falcon has been one of the most remarkable comeback stories in the world. And the way it's come back here on the East Coast, and the Delaware River is a real centerpiece in that. What's great about it is historically it tended to nest on cliffs and kind of high vantage points naturally, but it's adapted to now it still nests on cliffs where it can, but it now will also nest on the roofs of some skyscrapers or bridges. And so, because for them, you still have that safety from predators, combined with that high vantage point that they can dive from the skies at speeds over 200 miles an hour to catch prey, which is almost invariably smaller birds. So you have everything you need at the top of these bridges or skyscrapers for peregrine falcons. And that adaptability has been a big part of their comeback tale. And I mentioned over 200 miles an hour. They're the fastest animal on Earth. And we have them in Trenton, we have them in downtown Philly, we have them in New York City. So it's amazing that New Jersey is such a centerpiece for the fastest animal on Earth. Here in the metropolitan area, thanks to the water getting cleaner, we've seen comebacks from a number of animals like beaver and mink and muskrat. On land, we've seen red fox thriving more than ever. This again is testament to both the water getting cleaner and to land protection along the way, and to in some cases the animal's own adaptability as well. One of the great success stories, and granted it's on the other side of the river from New Jersey, but we'll talk about it nonetheless, is one of the very first metropolitan nature refuges, which is the John Hines Refuge, National Wildlife Refuge in Philly. It's a great story to have right next to this massive metropolis, which is the 5th largest city in the US. And you have this thriving marsh and forest ecosystem within the city, right along the edge of the city, where you have tons of raptors and wading birds and turtles and some of the mammals I just mentioned. all thriving within the city. Great blue herons and other wading birds like egrets and night herons. You'll see up and down the river. You see them in the metropolitan area, but then also right through the DNR region as well. And of course, you get through that metropolitan area, and you get through the. It's now we're talking about a big wide open river, which then pours into Delaware Bay, and Delaware Bay is arguably one of the very top wildlife destinations in the whole U.S. In some cases, which we'll talk about, in the world. So Delaware Bay, on either side, you have this vast marsh. It's very remote. In many ways, it's nothing like the rest of New Jersey. Here, this is the New Jersey side. Here's Cape May, which you may have been to Cape May over the course of your life, or maybe you go, every summer. But much of this area is off the beaten path. This is Cumberland County, northern Cape May County, and this is in many ways a snapshot back in time as well. This is an area, it's a vast salt marsh along the bay. The bay isn't nearly, it's visited about 1/10,000th about the number of people that visit the Atlantic coast. And other than Cape May, many people don't get down to this Delaware Bay shore at all. And so as a result, it's absolutely thriving for wildlife. And we'll talk about some of those species now. Ospreys are a great example. They're thriving. They're just like the falcons. They were down to just a few dozen, and the falcons, the eagles, the ospreys, the reason they declined so sharply was DDT. DDT, after the World War II years, DDT was used for agriculture in the US, and it was as an insecticide. It was tremendously effective. It was actually too effective, because it not only killed the insect pests that it was designed to kill, but it stayed in the system, it stayed in the ecosystem, and then in the wildlife that lived there. And so it went right up the food chains to the osprey, which was the top of the food chain eating the fish, the falcon, which was the top of the food chain eating all the birds, which ate all the smaller insects and everything else, and the eagle, which was a little of both. And so what it did was it got in their food, in their systems to such a degree that when ospreys or falcons or eagles would lay their eggs, brown pelicans, I should mention, were another one impacted by this. When they would lay their eggs, it could not support, their eggs were too thin to support their weight. So think about that. Their own nesting parent, it couldn't support their weight. And so you lost entire generations. So these birds either declined or were lost entirely for many states, including New Jersey. Once Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring and brought attention to it, and all the environmental laws were passed and largely inspired by that from the late 60s through the early 70s, you saw these species start to come back. And ospreys, just like the eagle and the falcon, have come back remarkably. We now have over 800 ospreys after just a few dozen in the early 80s, up and down the Atlantic coast and up and down the Delaware River. Then the Delaware Bayshore is a fantastic place for seeing them. Conserve Wildlife Foundation biologists have led putting up many of the platforms that you see all around the state to help the osprey come back. But yet, perhaps no bird story is as remarkable as that of the red knot, especially when you're looking at the Delaware River watershed. This bird is about the size of a robin that you might see outside your window. And so it's not a huge bird. And yet they fly every year as part of their migration. They fly from as far away as the southern tip of South America, Tierra del Fuego. It's the first land. You have a globe, you start at Antarctica and come up, the first land you see is Tierra del Fuego. And they fly all the way to here, to New Jersey, to the Delaware Bay shore. And they fly here every year right now. This is the time when they do it, during May. So from around a week into May until the very end of May or the first few days of June, they'll spend, each bird might spend anywhere from a week to two within that time frame at our coast. The same way we go down the shore each summer for boardwalk pizza and all those other boardwalk treats. Well, the red knots and other shorebirds come here every May to fatten up on horseshoe crab eggs. And just to give you an idea of this journey, that's a pretty incredible journey, right? Tierra del Fuego to Delaware Bay in New Jersey. But that's only the first leg of it. The second leg, once they've fattened up and gotten their energy, they then fly up to the Arctic, the Canadian Arctic, where they actually have They're so far north that our biologists, when they went and studied them there, had polar bear encounter. So you're literally talking bottom of the world to the top of the world and then back every year. And this is their life cycle. And the only way they're able to do this is because of the horseshoe crab eggs. But to give you an idea of the distance these birds travel, one bird, because we band, you can actually see it on this bird here. There's a band on its leg. We band them every year in Cape May during this time because they're declining so sharply in the last few decades. And thanks to the banding, we were able to get observations on individual birds. And so with the band numbers, we're able to say this bird that we found in 2014 was originally banded in 1998. And in that case, we ended up finding a bird, an individual bird that was lived to be roughly around 20 years old and had traveled the distance to the moon and 3/4 of the way back in its lifetime. A bird the size of a robin. It blows my mind thinking about that. A bird the size of a robin could travel the distance to the moon and back over the course of its life. And you know, it's extraordinary in the sense that that individual bird we were able to band and figure out the ages to that degree. But even the other birds that may not live that long, just the amount of distance they travel is remarkable. But again, Delaware Bay in New Jersey is the only way that works. And the reason why is because of this. This is red knot caviar, otherwise known as horseshoe crab eggs. And these tiny little eggs, they lay in massive clusters. They spawn, and actually the best night to see them spawning, the horseshoe crabs spawning, meaning they come up to the shore at night during a full moon is the best time, new moon is second best. And they get in groups. You'll see crab after crab after crab. Unfortunately, they're declining just like the red knots, and that's very much tied together. As the horseshoe crabs have declined, the red knots have declined as well. But they'll lay massive numbers of eggs, and they're not really protected. The sand covers a lot of them. They dig out a little bit as well to try to get them under the sand. But really, they're just laying as many as they can because they know most of them won't survive. And the reason most of them don't survive is because they feed the red knots, the other shorebirds, and tons of other wildlife. They feed everything from diamondback terrapins and eel to flounder, sea turtles. I mean, it's to small invertebrates. I mean, it's absolutely almost anything and everything you can picture in the bay ecosystem will eat or in some way utilize horseshoe crab eggs as part of its sustenance. And so we've seen declines, you know, in weak fish have declined as well. So it's not just the red knots that decline once the horseshoe crabs decline. And what's amazing is the horseshoe crab story, in some ways, even tops the red knot story. And I thought the red knot, you know, had everything be flying from Tierra del Fuego to here every year, and then the Arctic and back. But the horseshoe crabs predated the dinosaurs. They actually predated flowering plants and flying insects. So the world back then, it was so early as we picture the world's development. And yet horseshoe crabs had arose during that time, you know, the time of trilobites and things like that. And yet lasted through all those, the 5 major extinctions, they lasted. They survived. You know, they were so long ago that many scientists think the same way that red knots depend on horseshoe crab eggs now. Pterodactyls may have fed on horseshoe crab eggs along the coast back in their time. So you had this historic story. But what, from our perspective, this year, if there was ever any doubt why wildlife is important, this year clinched it. Horseshoe crab blood, because it's so ancient, this blue blood, it has a component called lysate. It's the only way in the US, the only allowed way for companies to test vaccines and any kind of injectable devices or implants, anything that goes into our bloodstream, to test them for harmful bacteria is through horseshoe crab blood, the only way. And because it has this unique clotting ability. And so they're able to see right away if there's any kind of contaminant, any kind of bacterial contaminant. And this coagulation by horseshoe crab blood basically made those vaccines that we all treasure right now possible. And so in many ways, every person who has gotten one of the vaccines in the US for COVID has the horseshoe crab to thank, whether we know it or not. And again, though, to put into perspective, the horseshoe crab, the Atlantic horseshoe crab, by far the best spot, the spot where it has the largest numbers and where we're able to fill the supply for what's needed for these vaccine tests, is Delaware Bay here in New Jersey. So absolutely remarkable that this is kind of, in a sense, driving this massive emergency health response by this primitive, easy to overlook creature that swims along New Jersey's Delaware Bay. As I mentioned, they're declining sharply through both through harvesting in certain states. New Jersey doesn't allow harvesting, but other states do. Through, they're also taken for the bleeding process. And then they're also at risk for climate change. Hurricane Sandy nearly wiped out all the beaches. We had to restore them. Conserve Wildlife led the effort to restore those beaches with so many partners. And they're also, our changing shoreline with both climate change and then development along the coast will often result in horseshoe crabs getting caught in rubble or overturned and unable to right themselves before a gull gets to them, or maybe they dry out before the tide brings them back in. And so a great program called Return the Favor, which is a volunteer program that around a dozen nonprofit groups, including Conserve Wildlife and many others, take part in, has roughly saved over 500,000 horseshoe crabs in the past 6 years. And it's one of the most simple and easy to understand volunteer programs. You literally go out to these remote beaches and you connect with somebody from the program, but then you go out to these remote beaches and you basically overturn the crabs that need your help. That's it. There's no scientific training needed. Kids can do it, seniors can do it. Anyone who's able to walk around can literally go out and save some lives. So a fantastic program. I mentioned climate change along the Bayshore, and that's where we see it the most. This is the Delaware Bayshore in New Jersey is subsiding faster than anywhere else in the state, which is also subsiding faster than in most other places along the East Coast. So, and that's part of, it's the land sinking at the same time that the water's coming up. And then this land sinking in the sense of like historical subsiding. And so when it's without the water rising, it wouldn't be much of an issue, but because they're both happening at the same time, that poses a long-term risk to species like the diamondback terrapin, which is again one of those that depends on the horseshoe crab eggs, among many other things. But also salt marsh sparrow is another one that we may lose entirely without climate change being abated in some way. A couple other spectacles along the Great Delaware Bayshore, which this gives you an idea of kind of just you have these vast salt marshes and then forests, very little human impacts in many of these places. Every August, purple martins, this gorgeous bird, is found by the Morristown Bridge, and that's spelled like Maurice, but it's pronounced Morris, as I learned when I was down there for the book and made the mistake of saying, "Where's Mauricetown?" And everybody in the place looked at me like I was crazy. They gather in incredible numbers, around 40,000 or more. And on certain August evenings, you can see them coming out right around dusk from these bridges and these other local spots. So just a nice, if you ever go down to Cape May during this time of year, during August, that would be a nice stopover, maybe on your way back or way there. River otters are another one you can see up and down the river, but they're especially plentiful down in the Delaware Bay area and some of the smaller tributaries. Not always easy to see, but maybe you get fortunate and see one. A couple other creatures that we've had we have in Delaware Bay, but are seals, but occasionally one will come up as far as the central part of the river, which is always an exciting setting. Here's one you would never think of as New Jersey, similar to some of the ones I mentioned in the northern part of the state, like the moose. This one is not that infrequent, but we do get manatees. Maybe every summer we might get a couple of sightings along Delaware Bay, and some along our Atlantic coast as well. Talk about one, when I first heard that, maybe a decade ago, I just was in shock because I just always assumed that you'd only see them in the canals in Florida and maybe as far north as Georgia. And it's not that their range has dramatically increased, that we're suddenly seeing tons of them, but just more like individuals every summer. You might get a few individuals who just make their way up and not traveling in a group, but you might get one here, one there, that make their way up here. And it's a combination of the water is warming a little by little each year. And then secondly, the fact that along the East Coast, you have so many power plants that will warm the water quite a bit in those pockets. So think of it like stepping stones for these individual manatees. And this shot is, I didn't take it, this shot is from the Delaware River. This is actually right near the mouth of Crosswicks Creek from about a decade ago, I believe. As the water gets warm in these stepping stones, they kind of will keep coming north. And so maybe they would have turned around, but now lo and behold, they're entering another power plant outfall. And I can keep going, and I'm trying to get in the mind of a manatee and, doing the best I can. So don't quote me. Here's a species that isn't an accidental visitor as much as a relic and one of the most unique creatures we have on the East Coast. And the Delaware Bay is crucial for them, the American eel. It's the only catadromous species we have on the East Coast. And what that means is catadromous, it means it's born out here in the ocean and then swims into freshwater to live most of its adult life. And they have a remarkable cycle. I could do a talk just on their cycle with like 7 different phases of life and looking different along the way. But the short of it is they're out here in the Sargasso Sea past Bermuda and basically then swim over the course of the different phases, swim all the way into the Delaware Bay and then up the Delaware River. And in the course of that, they go from this tiny little glass eel to these long major predators of fish and other marine creatures, 3, 4, 5 feet long. Unfortunately, eels, like many of the others we've talked about, are declining, and they have been overfished, and we've seen their numbers drop quite a bit. However, we haven't seen their numbers drop anything like the Atlantic sturgeon. The Atlantic sturgeon was once a fixture of Delaware Bay. It was huge numbers. It was found, around the turn of the century, around 1900. But around that, or a little before 1900, but around that time, it started to be used for caviar, which went through a huge boom period. And so at one point, you had something like some outrageous number, over 100,000 pounds of caviar in 1 year. Caviar, just tiny little eggs, 100,000 pounds just from the Delaware Bay region. That basically almost entirely wiped out the Atlantic sturgeon population to where we only had a handful of fish survive. And now they're holding steady, but they're in such small numbers that they're tremendously vulnerable. We have a number of scientists in New Jersey and neighboring states who are studying them and doing a fantastic job building up our understanding and knowledge of them. But they face major threats, everything from dredging and shipping to climate change. So, but you see, they when they were allowed to grow large and didn't have the threats they have now, I mean, these are massive fish. They're also prehistoric. They rival the horseshoe crab. They don't go back quite that far, but they go back really, really far. They swam with the dinosaurs. And, interestingly enough, they also play into our COVID situation in a different way than the horseshoe crab. They're a great guideline. I know, I can't tell you, since I saw this sign about a year ago, I can't tell you how many times I was standing in Target and in line and wondering, am I far enough from the person in front of me? And all I had to do was think, hey, is this a 26-year-old Atlantic sturgeon in distance? And often I'd realize I was only like a 20-year-old Atlantic sturgeon and had to back up a step. So just keep that in mind next time. I know we're getting past this, but if you are in a store, just keep that in mind, please. We've had a couple other visitors that you would never expect. We had a right whale make it up past Philly. It was, of course, the newspapers came up with a catchy name, Waldo, the wrong way right whale. Say that 5 times fast and had some fun with the headlines. We had a beluga whale about 2005 that swam all the way up, instead of its normal haunts would be the Gulf of Maine or north, swam all the way past Cape Cod, past Long Island, New York City, all along the Atlantic coast. past Cape May, and then swam up the Delaware Bay, all the way up the Delaware River to Trenton. And now I don't know if it had an issue with its taxes and it was trying to work it out, but it basically, the beluga whale swam up to Trenton, but here the water's brackish, so it's all white Arctic. Visage stood out tremendously. And of course, as you see, the news got a hold of it. But what was great with this is for a few days, you had residents families who had lived in Trenton their whole lives, workers who had worked for decades in Trenton and never gone down to the waterfront, all of a sudden going out on their lunch break and seeing a beluga whale. And if any of us on this call wanted to see a beluga whale, now we would probably have to spend thousands of dollars and fly up to the Arctic and maybe join an expedition and maybe have a chance of seeing one. And yet they're out there having their coffee and their sandwich at lunch break and watching one in Trenton. Just absolutely remarkable, and speaks to that thought that you never know with nature. And finally, to tie it all full circle, we started with eagles, and why not end with eagles? The best place, as eagles have made their extraordinary comeback from one nest in New Jersey in the early 80s, the failing nest I mentioned, to this year, over 300 eagles in the state, 300 nesting eagles. And we're now in every county. Eagles are now in every county in the state. However, the lower Delaware River and Delaware Bay is the best place in the state by far. Roughly nearly 50% of our bald eagles, nesting bald eagles, are in this region here. And to put it into perspective, outside of the Chesapeake, it's the next most thriving bald eagle population on the whole East Coast is New Jersey's Delaware Bay. And so I think that's a triumphant recovery, and it really does mirror the recovery of the Delaware River from this an area that was so drastically polluted to an area where wildlife is again thriving up and down the river, and wildlife of all kinds, of all stripes and shapes and forms. And it's really remarkable. And I wanted to leave you with what I'll call a greatest hits list for the Delaware River for visiting. If you haven't already, and we've talked about most of these, but you have the headwaters, of course, up in New York. You have High Point State Park and Stokes State Forest and the Water Gap, which are just incredibly scenic. You have major elevation changes in these and very rugged habitat, and a great way to see it, whether you see it by water or by land. You have, of course, the Sourlands and Washington Crossing and the Abbott Marshlands. We'll call this the DNR region, and of course the newest acquisition, Point Breeze. And these are just some incredible areas to visit as well. You have Palmyra Cove a little bit further downstream, which is another great stopover during this migration. I just read earlier today from a bird watcher who saw 12 different species of warblers in one tree in Palmyra Cove earlier today. So 12 different species in one tree. It's mind-boggling. You have, of course, the Hines Wildlife Refuge I mentioned. You have Bombay Hook on the Delaware side, and of course the Delaware Bayshore, both in Cumberland County, which is even really remote, and Reed's Beach, which is the best place on the New Jersey side to really see the horseshoe crab spectacle and all the red knots and ruddy turnstones and all the shorebirds descending. Fingers crossed that we have good numbers this year. And I can even give you your best date for this. May 26th is the full moon. And that's when the horseshoe crab spawning will be at its peak. If you go right around dusk, that's your best bet. And it's a long drive, but if you haven't been there in a while, or if you have and you just want to see something dramatic, you have really great odds at seeing something that night. And Reed's Beach, there's plenty of directions online for how to get to the viewing platform and everything there. Just a quick reminder, many of the species we talked about today, particularly pollinators and songbirds, you can make a huge difference for. Planting native goes a long way. I encourage you to volunteer with DNR or Conserve Wildlife or other groups. And then really look to just get the word out there and use your voice to whatever degree you can to help wildlife. It goes a long way, and nonprofits like ours certainly depend on people like you. And I encourage you to take a look at our website, conservewildlifenj.org. We have field guides, detailed field guides for many of the species we mentioned today. And we also have free wildlife webcams for peregrine falcons, ospreys, and eagles, where you can get a close-up look at them nesting, and it's happening right now. This is during the peak of those nesting seasons. So with that, I thank you so much, and I'd be happy to answer a few questions if anyone has any.
David, thank you so much. That was such an amazing overview of the wildlife we have here in little old New Jersey, and it's all because of this amazing resource of the Delaware River.
That's
that
right.
was really eye-opening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I have a question just to start us off, and
Sure.
everybody else who's in this meeting, feel free to type your questions in the chat and we'll try to call them out. We have time for a few at the end here. But going back to the beginning, when you mentioned your Bobcat reintroduction release, when you do things like that, do you have any way of tracking the animals that you release into the wild to see how long they survive?
Yeah, and so the Bobcat release, that I'll preface that was even before Conserve Wildlife. That was like late 70s through that was 78 through 82, I believe, were the years those were done. But in general, anytime we release an animal, which is not often, the ones I can think of right off the bat were the Bobcats and the bald eagles were the ones that come to mind. But typically those will have some kind of band. So the bands help because, you know, when the animal dies or maybe a photographer gets an image, you're able to then identify and go back and see, okay, this was an animal that was caught here, released here in however many years ago, hopefully. And it gives you an idea of their life cycle and their range. Nowadays with GPS, occasionally we're able to GPS an individual and basically get even more time sensitive, you know, kind of tracking. So we're able to see, for instance, we did with a couple, it's expensive, so it's not something we can do often, but we did that with two bald eagles about 5 years ago, and one flew north to Quebec, one flew south to Florida, and then they ended up back in the same place around Forsyth Refuge in New Jersey about a year later. So it's great because it just reminds you that each animal is an individual.
Yeah, very cool. I see here that Linda Mead, our president and CEO of D&R Greenway, she has a couple things to say in the chat. First of all, saying that, David, I always learn something new from you. Loved hearing about snowy owls and the fastness of the peregrine falcon. I've seen a lot of fox over the past few years. Why has their population increased so much?
That's a great question. And to some degree, it's an open question. I think probably the broadest way to look at it is they've adapted very well. Similar to some of the other animals. We have right now a number of kind of what I'll call mid-sized mammals that have adapted very well to people and to modern civilization here in the Northeast. And so foxes, skunks, raccoons, they know how to live amongst, in many cases, crowded neighborhoods, and yet stay out of sight most of the time. Now we see them, but we're not usually seeing the same fox every day because the individuals know how to more or less stay out of sight. We're absolutely looked at as a threat. And so for many of those animals, they're nocturnal. In the case of the foxes, they kind of are able to live underfoot and in most cases stay out of our way and thus stay out of danger for themselves. So it's a big part of it is just adapting and kind of finding their niche in modern human civilization.
Thank you. Kathy is asking if this is recorded. It is being recorded, and we'll try to have this uploaded to our YouTube channel. You can just search DNR Greenway Land Trust on YouTube, and you'll be able to find this in the next couple weeks sometime. So with that, David, thank you so much again for coming and speaking with us today. I forgot to mention that Conserve Wildlife is going to be our new neighbor here on Preservation Place. I'm sure some of you have visited our office building, the Johnson Education Center at 1 Preservation Place, but Conserve Wildlife is moving right next door. So we're really excited to have them as our new neighbor here.
Thank you,
Um,
Maria. Yeah, we're thrilled. And thank you. And thank Linda as well for hosting tonight. And we're so excited to join you on the campus as well.
well, great. Thanks, everybody. And I hope to see you next week.
Okay, take care, everybody.
Bye.